I'm gonna ramble. You want to ramble with me? Don't. Go ramble in your own video. I'm rambling right now. I'm gonna talk about top-down versus bottom-up design. Now, I'm almost positive I've talked about this in a previous video on some other topic, but it has come to the forefront for me recently due to some, big surprise, online discussions that I've been having with people. In this case, weirdly, not on Reddit, where I spent too much time. No, this was someone who was talking about, the conversation itself doesn't matter. The point is that they were talking about, 4th edition character creation feeling restrictive. Which I didn't get a big elaboration on what they meant by that, but what usually people mean by that when they say it is that the things that they try to do in 5th don't work in 4th. And that it can feel like it can feel restrictive, to be honest. You can't have a character that does everything like you can with, say, for example, a wizard in 5th edition. And that kind of comes down to the more focused design of 4th edition characters. The game really wants you to be good at something and not good at other things. Which is to say that, if you are a defender, you are going to be good at absorbing attacks, at protecting allies, at punishing enemies for defying you. If you are a leader, you are going to be good at buffing allies. You're going to be passing out healing effects. You maybe are going to play with the action economy a little bit, pass out actions to your allies. Those kinds of things. And, those two roles may touch on each other, and depending on the specific class, you may have some more or less overlap into other roles. But for the most part, you are going to be focused on the one thing that your role is supposed to be good at. So there's a more focused design. But more than that, that's sort of the surface level issue that some people have with making characters for 4th edition. The other issue is that they are accustomed to a bottom-up design where they're accustomed to which one is which? Hang on. Top down, bottom. Sorry, they are accustomed to a top-down design where at the top level, which is the lighter, more flavor-oriented stuff, sort of dictates what mechanics you are allowed to have. I've talked about this kind of in my video on power sources and why the lack of power sources in 5th edition is not just a thematic difference from 4th, but it informs the mechanics, because fighters have no power source, and therefore their flavor has nothing to drip down to have good mechanics. That's why martials are so bad in 5th edition. If, spoilers for the conclusion of that episode. That's why martials are so bad, because they have no power source. There's no flavor to justify having strong mechanics. Whereas for spellcasters, you have this entire, power source, either the arcane spells, divine spells, gods, patrons, arcane secrets, and those all trickle down into the mechanics of having really strong, really effective, and highly diverse class features known as spells. So that's 5th edition's design. It's very top down, flavor first, and then that dictates the mechanics, and which is a big part of why the 5th edition has such terrible balance, because it's impossible to have that setup result in, not impossible, statistically incredibly unlikely to have that kind of setup and result in two different classes that have different power sources, different flavor, to wind up at about the same power level. So one is going to be stronger than the other. Whichever one, honestly, it's whichever one the author of the class, that whoever's writing the class, it's whichever one they like better. It's whichever one sort of resonates with them more. They are naturally going to have more ideas for that class. They're going to favor it And not saying that like, oh, I like wizards, therefore I'm going to make them stronger. I don't think that that ever was a part of the thought process. But it's like, wizards are really cool. They should have all of these abilities. They should have the best spells in a game where spells are the best thing in the game. They should be able, like, there's nothing that they can think of that wizards shouldn't be able to do because they like wizards so much. So wizards can do everything. The opposite of this, which is where 4th edition does it, is bottom-up design, where you have a baseline of mechanics, and then growing up from those mechanics are this nod to the flavor text that justifies why those mechanics exist. The advantage of this, and I think the way that it is most ideal to run it and to play it, is to take those mechanics. The mechanics are law. You don't change the mechanics. Unless, of course, unless, like, there are times when you really need to, but that's an exception, and maybe I'll get to that later. But you take the mechanics as law. You don't change the mechanics, but you reflavor them to fit whatever character concept you are trying to construct. So if you have a character, say, for example, here's the classic example that keeps coming up. This is sort of the chiefest complaint that I've seen people talk about in regards to the way that 4E characters are designed, especially when it comes to martials. The fighter should be equally good with ranged attacks and melee attacks. They should use all weapons equally. Why? Why does that need to be the fighter? First off, I kind of disagree with the idea that should even be a class. That is a level of, not flavor, but it is a level of like class identity that I think doesn't really need to exist because it doesn't inform the play experience. Like, what are you doing with these weapons? Now, there's a few different ways to approach this, particularly as it refers to the fighter. One, the fighter actually is pretty good with ranged weapons. If you take the 4E fighter gets +1 to either one-handed weapons or two-handed weapons. You choose at level 1. If you take two-handed weapons, that includes bows. It doesn't say melee weapons. So you actually are better at ranged weapons than a baseline character. A character with a hypothetical NPC with no class features, with the same stats. You are still better. You get that +1. The fighter isn't designed to be a ranged class. And it doesn't need to be. I personally don't get this argument that the fighter should be good at ranged attacks. I just don't see it. Now, should there be a class that is, pretty equally good at ranged and melee attacks? Maybe. I'm not saying there shouldn't be. I don't think there needs to be, but there could be. Sure. That is a fantasy for some people. Sure. So let's say that there should be. Does it need to be the fighter? Well, I would say no. As long as it exists, you can build your character, because your character is not going to describe themselves as a fighter in universe. You would be some kind of a warrior, but warrior is a very broad term and it covers a lot of different classes. So if you have your character concept and you say I'm going to be swapping between melee and ranged attacks as the situation dictates, and I want to be pretty good at both. Don't be a fighter, be a ranger. Ranger is free of a lot of the sort of nature and magic using baggage that it has in 3rd edition and 5th edition. So you can be you take a ranger, call yourself a fighter. Literally just cross out the word ranger and write fighter in there and just use the rules for ranger. That is the kind of approach that I think 4th edition is really meant for. The other class, of course, that you could do this with is Warlord, because Warlord, best class, and they're actually even slightly better at switching back and forth between melee and ranged, because they have some ranged powers that use strength as the attack stat, which is just great. Whereas with the ranger, you kind of have to split between dex and strength, which means that there's some opportunity cost there, basically. Not to get too deep into the mechanics of it. So this idea that to be a fighter, you have to take the fighter class is kind of weird. And something that I've done personally in multiple editions is that I like the aesthetics of the Ranger, but I usually don't like the Ranger class. I don't have anything specifically against the 4th edition Ranger. I find it a little bit dry for my personal style. I didn't really like the Ranger in 3rd edition, and I very much don't like the Ranger in 5th. But what I do is I make Ranger characters without using the Ranger class, usually some sort of mix of like fighter and something else. I did a warlord in 4th edition who was I was very woodsy. I used a bow. I was aesthetically exactly a Ranger. Everything you would think about for a Ranger, but I did not take the Ranger class because classes do not exist in the world. They are non-diegetic, which means that you can take any class that fits the mechanical fantasy for your character and then say that you are whatever it is that you want your character to be. If let's say, for example, you want a character who is a sorcerer, their bloodline, and I'm going to just really quick transition over to 5th edition, because you can do this to an extent in 5th edition. It is harder to do, but here's like an example of what you could do. If you want to be a sorcerer, you have a magical bloodline. But your bloodline is not dragons, and it's not angels or demons. Your bloodline literally is a forgotten god. It's some eldritch entity from the dawn of time. Take the warlock class, you can get some of the like spookier powers. You can certainly still do this with sorcery. You can get some of the spookier powers, that sort of like warlock essence, and then just call yourself a sorcerer. Just call yourself a sorcerer. That's all you need to do. Like the distinction, like you can say that you are a thing in the world. You don't have to be that thing mechanically. This is what they mean when they say flavor is free. You take the mechanical concept that fits your character's playstyle, and then you say what you are in universe. In my setting, the word paladin has a lot of baggage to it. It is basically their version of a knight. There are paladin orders that are not all paladin character classes. Like, they don't all wear heavy armor. They don't all have divine magic. They don't all lay on hands. They don't all smite. There's lots of different kinds of characters. Scouts, support characters. You've got basic warriors with no magic. You've got, straight up mages. Those can all be paladins in my setting, because a paladin is more of a rank. It's more of an occupation than it is a category of like magic user, basic magic using warrior. Those certainly exist, but they aren't, but like that, the words do not have the same meaning that they mean to us as players. So if somebody wants to be a member of a paladin order, they do not have to be the paladin class. And similarly, if they want to play a paladin class, they do not have to be a member of a paladin order. So you would not describe yourself as a paladin. You would describe yourself as a holy warrior of some sort. Or you might even say you're a cleric, because like the line between cleric and paladin is very blurry for those who are in the world. And this may differ based on your particular setting, but like I think that it is far preferable to have a disconnection between the flavor of a class and the mechanics of the class. The more disconnected those are, the better, because it makes the class more versatile. You don't need, and Jeremy Crawford recently, was it Jeremy Crawford? No, Chris Perkins. It was Chris Perkins recently that commented that he thinks there's too many classes in D&D. Well, kind of, yes and no. Because the way 5th edition does things, it kind of locks you into one identity, because the flavor, you started with the flavor and then it trickled down into mechanics. If you had mechanics that grow up into flavor, you can sort of cut that top part off and put your own flavor in its place. And then you don't need that many classes. You only need as many classes as you have mechanical ideas, and so that all the classes end up mechanically distinct, as they do in 4th edition. But if you start with flavor and you trickle down into mechanics, you cut that off, the mechanics fall away. Now you are left with flavor. I think there's not enough flavor to go around for all the different classes. Like, there's clearly a lot of overlap. Like, what is conceptually the difference between a sorcerer and a wizard? They get their spells in different ways. Well, sure, but what does that mean, though? You know, does that mean that I can't play a sorcerer who has learned to use their magical ability, learned with intelligence? Does that mean I can't play a wizard who just has this sort of magical knack and they don't have to study? They're a savant. They're a prodigy. And so they don't think about it. They just do it instinctively. Well, it's harder to justify it because the flavor of those classes are so heavily ingrained into their mechanics. It's harder to do. Not impossible. It certainly is not impossible, but it is a lot harder. Because of the top-down design of 5th edition, the flavor is really assumed in a lot of cases, and it's integrated into the mechanics in ways that are annoying to deal with. If you like to play like me, where I take a basic mechanic and I like to fill in my own flavor text. When I remember a long time ago, I used to narrate if my character shifts away in 4th edition or if they disengage in 5th. I like to narrate, that action is not carefully backing away, which is sort of the default flavor. I like to think of it more as I create a distraction and move away. I'm going to feint an attack and then jump back, that kind of thing. You fill in your own flavor because the mechanic does not have any baked in flavor. It's just withdrawing safely. Any kind of withdrawing safely, because there isn't because it doesn't read out in a very specific way with mechanics that refer to the individual parts of the refer to the individual parts of the flavor. There isn't any connection between flavor and mechanics there, so I can fill in my own flavor, and I think that is a preferable way to play compared to having to use or feeling obligated to use the flavor that is offered to me in the books. Sip. So that's my take on top-down versus bottom-up design, and where I think a lot of people get tripped up on that because they expect top-down. If they've only played 5th edition, they probably expect everything to be the same sort of top-down design. Whereas with bottom-up design, you have a strong mechanical foundation and you fill in whatever flavor text you want. Top-down, you have the flavor text and then mechanics to refer to it, which has its own issues, and I'm almost positive I've talked about this before, where it kind of builds into checklist design. If you don't have a really good design team with top-down, because top-down can work in theory. I don't know that I've ever seen a great example of it working, but it can work in theory if you have a really solid design team, and they don't get lazy, and they don't start taking, okay, here's our list of flavor points, and we need to have mechanics for each of them. And so we're going to check off on the list as we go through each of these flavor points. Yeah, yes, we have a mechanic to represent that. We have a mechanic to represent that. We have a mechanic to represent that, without any thought towards the gameplay experience. Or is it faithfully represented? Or is it just sort of, a token tip of the hat, head nod to the flavor? Which is where I think a lot of 5th edition mechanics end up. But that's just me.